Reflections on a Rotten Apple. Our age is obviously the nonsense age, the wiser sort of nonsense being provided for the children, and the sillier sort of nonsense for the grown-up people. The 18th century has been called the Age of Reason. I suppose there is no doubt that the 20th century is the Age of Unreason, but even that is an understatement. The Age of Reason was nicknamed for a famous rationalist book, but the rationalist was not really so much concerned to urge the rational against the irrational, but rather specially to urge the natural against the supernatural. But there is a degree of the unreasonable that would go even beyond the unnatural. It is not merely an incredible tale, but an inconsistent tale. As I pointed out to somebody long ago, it is one thing to believe that a beanstalk scaled the sky, and quite another to believe that 57 beans make 5. For instance, a man may disbelieve in miracles, normally on some a priori principle of determinist thought, in some cases even on an examination of the evidence. But on being told of the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, he is told something that is logical, if not natural. He is told that there were fewer fishes. He is not told that there were fewer fishes because the fishes had been multiplied. Multiplication is still a mathematical term, and a mob of all feeding on miraculous fishes is a less mysterious or monstrous sight than man saying that multiplication is the same as subtraction. Such a story, for such a skeptic, does not carry conviction, but it does make sense. He can recognize the logical consequence if he cannot understand the logical cause, but no pope or priest ever asked him to believe that thousands died of starvation in the desert because they were loaded with loaves and fishes. No creed or dogma or even ever declared that there was too little food because there was too much fish. But that is the precise, practical, and prosaic definition of the present situation in the modern science of economics. And the man of the nonsense age must bow his head and repeat his credo, the motto of his time, credo quia impossibili, I believe because it is impossible. Or again, the term unreason is sometimes used rather more reasonably for a sort of loose or elliptical statement, which is at least illogical in form. The most popular case is what was called the Irish bull, often suspected of resembling the papal bull, or being a supernatural monster bred of credulity and superstition. But even this old sort of confusion stops short of the new sort of contradiction. If any Irishman really does say, "We are not birds to be in two places at once," at least we know what he means, even if it is not what he says. But suppose he says that one bird has been miraculously multiplied into 1,000,000 birds, and that in consequence there are fewer birds in the world than there were before. We should then be dealing not merely with an Irish bull, but with a mad bull, and concerned not with the incredible, but with the incomprehensible. Or, to apply the parable, the Irish have sometimes been accused of unbalanced emotion or morbid sentiment, but nobody says that they merely imagined the great famine, in which multitudes starved because the potatoes were few and small. Only suppose an Irishman had said that they were starved because the potatoes were gigantic and innumerable. I think we should not yet have heard the last of the wrong-headed absurdity of that Irishman. Yet that is an exact description of the economic condition today as it affects the Englishman, and to a great extent the American. We learn that there is a famine because there is not a scarcity, and there is such a good potato crop that there are no potatoes. The Irishman with his bull or his bird is quite a hard-headed realist and a rationalist compared to that. Thus, the old examples of the fantastic fell far short of the modern fact, whether they were mysteries supposed to be above reason or mere muddles supposed to be below it. Their miracles were more normal than our scientific averages, and the Irish blunder was less illogical than the actual logic of events. For it seems that we live today in a world of witchcraft, in which the orchards wither because they prosper, and the multitude of apples on the apple tree of itself turns them into forbidden fruit, and makes the effort to consume them in every sense fruitless. This is the modern economic paradox, which is called overproduction, or a glut in the market, and though at first sight it sounds like the wildest fantasy, it is well to realize in what sense it is the most solid of facts. Let it be clearly understood, therefore, that as a description of the objective social situation at this instant in this industrial society, the paradox is perfectly true. But it is not really true that the contradiction in terms is true. If we take it not as a description but as a definition, if we take it as a matter of abstract argument, then certainly the contradiction is untrue, as every contradiction is untrue. The truth is that a third element has entered into the matter, which is not mentioned in the abstract statement of it. That element might be stated in many ways. Perhaps the shortest statement of it is in the fable of the man who sold razors and afterwards explained to an indignant customer with simple dignity that he had never said the razors would shave. When asked if razors were not made to shave, he replied that they were made to sell. It is a short history of trade and industry during the 19th and early 20th centuries. God made a world of reason, as sure as God made little apples, as beautiful as the beautiful proverb goes. And God did not make little apples larger than large apples. It is not true that a man whose apple tree is loaded with apples will suffer from a want of apples, though he may indulge in a waste of apples. But if he never looks upon apples as things to eat, but always looks on them as things to sell, he will really get into another sort of complication, which may end in a sort of contradiction. If instead of producing apples, and producing as many apples as he wants, he produces as many apples as he imagines the whole world wants, with the hope of capturing the trade of the whole world, then he will either be successful or unsuccessful in competing with the man next door, who also wants the whole world's trade to himself. Between them they will produce so many apples that apples in the market will be about as valuable as pebbles on the beach. Thus each of them will find he has very little money in his pocket, with which to go and buy fresh pears at the fruiterer's shop. If he had never expected to get fruit at the fruiterer's shop, but had put up his hand and pulled them off his own tree, his difficulty would never have arisen. It seems simple, but at the root of all apple trees, the apple growing, it is really that simple. Of course, I do not mean that the practice is at present simple, for no practical problem is simple, least of all at the present time, when everything is confused by the corrupt and evasive muddlers who are called practical politicians. But the principle is simple, and the whole way to proceed through a complex situation is to start with the right first principle. How far can we do without, or control, or merely modify the disadvantages of buying and selling is quite another matter. But the disadvantages do arise from buying and selling, and not from producing, not even from overproducing. And it is some satisfaction to realize that we are not living in a nightmare in which no is the same as yes, that even the modern world has not actually gone mad, with all its ingenious attempts to do so, that 2 and 2 do in fact make 4, and that the man who has got 4 apples really has more than the man who has 3. For some modern metaphysicians and moral philosophers seem disposed to leave us in doubt on these points. It is not the fundamental reason in things that is at fault. It is a particular hitch or falsification arising from a very recent trick of regarding everything only in relation to trade. Trade is all very well in its way, but trade has been put in the place of truth. Trade, which is in its nature a secondary or dependent thing, has been treated as a primary and independent thing, and as an absolute. The moderns, mad upon mere multiplication, have even made a plural out of what is eternally singular, in the sense of single. They have taken what all ancient philosophers called the good and translated it as the goods. I believe that certain mystics in the American business world protested against the slump by pinning labels on their coats inscribed, "Trade is good," along with other similar proclamations such as, "Capone is dead," or "Cancer is pleasant," or "Death is abolished," or any other hard, realistic truths for which they might find space upon upon their persons. But what interests me about these magicians is that, having decided to call up ideal conditions by means of spells and incantations to control the elements, they did not, so to speak, understand the elements of the elements. They did not go to the root of the matter and imagine that their troubles had really come to an end. Rather, they worshipped the means instead of the end. While they were about it, they ought to have said, not trade is good, but living is good, or life is good. I suppose it would be too much to expect that such thoroughly respectable people to say, God is good. But it is really true that their conception of what is good lacks the philosophical finality that belonged to the goodness of God. When God looked on created things and saw that they were good, it meant that they were good in themselves and as they stood. But by the modern mercantile idea, God would only have looked at them and seen that they were the goods. In other words, there would have been a label tied to the tree or the hill, and as to the hat of the Mad Hatter, with this style, 10.6. All the flowers and birds would be ticketed with their reduced prices. All creation would be for sale, or all the creatures seeking employment, with all the morning stars making sky signs together, and all the sons of God shouting for jobs. In other words, these people are incapable of imagining anything good except that which comes from bartering something for something else. The idea of a man enjoying a thing in itself, for himself, is inconceivable to them. The notion of a man eating his own apples off his own apple tree seems like a fairy tale. Yet the fall from that first creation that was called good has very largely come from the restless impotence for valuing things in themselves, the madness of the trader who cannot see any good in a good, except as something to get rid of. It was once admitted that with sin and death there entered the world something that we call change. It is none the less true and tragic because what we call change we called afterwards exchange. Anyhow, the result of that extravagance of exchange has been that when there are too many apples, there are too few apple eaters. I do not insist on the symbol of Eden or the parable of the apple tree, but it is odd to notice that even that accidental image pursues us at every stage of this strange story. The last result of treating a tree as a shop or a store instead of as a storeroom, the last effect of treating apples as goods rather than as a good, has been in a desperate drive of public charity and in poor men selling apples in the street. In all normal civilizations, the trader exists and must exist. But in all normal civilizations, the trader was the exception. Certainly he was never the rule, and most certainly he was never the ruler. The predominance which he has gained in the modern world is the cause of all disasters of the modern world. The universal habit of humanity has been to produce and consume as part of the same process, largely conducted by the same people in the same place. Sometimes goods were produced and consumed on the same great feudal manor, sometimes even on the same small peasant farm. Sometimes there was a tribute from serfs, as yet hardly distinguishable from slaves. Sometimes there was a cooperation between freemen which the superficial can hardly distinguish from communism. But none of these many historical methods, whatever their vices or limitations, was strangled in the particular tangle of our own time, because most of the people for most of the time were thinking about growing food and then eating it, not entirely about growing food and selling it at the stiffest price to somebody who had nothing to eat. And I, for one, do not believe that there is any way out of the modern tangle except to increase the proportion of the people who are living according to the ancient simplicity. Nobody in his five wits proposes that there should be no trade and no traders. Nevertheless, it is important to remember as a matter of mere logic that there might conceivably be great wealth even if there were no trade and no traders. It is important for the sort of man whose only hope is that trade is good, or whose only secret terror is that trade is bad. In principle, prosperity might be very great, even if trade were very bad. If a village were so fortunately situated that for some reason it was easy for everybody to keep its own chickens, every family to keep its own chickens, to grow its own vegetables, to milk its own cow, and I will add, to brew its own beer, the standard of life and prosperity might be very high indeed, even though the long memory of the oldest inhabitant only recorded 2 or 3 pure transactions of trade. If he could only recall one far-off event of his neighbor buying a new hat from a gypsy's barrow, or the singular incident of Farmer Billings purchasing an umbrella. As I have said, I do not imagine or desire that things would ever be quite so simple as that, but we must understand things in their simplicity before we can explain or correct their complexity. The complexity of commercial society has become intolerable because that society is commercial and nothing else. The whole mind of the community is occupied not with the idea of possessing things, but with the idea of passing them on. When the simple enthusiasts already mentioned say that trade is good, they mean that all the people who possess goods are perpetually parting with them. These optimists presumably invoke the poet, with some slight emendation of the poet's meaning when he cries aloud, "Our souls are love, and a perpetual farewell." In that sense, our individualistic and commercial modern society is actually the very reverse of a society founded on private property. I mean that the actual direct and isolated enjoyment of private property, as distinct from the excitement of exchanging it or getting a profit on it, is rather rarer than in many simple communities that seem almost communal in their simplicity. In the case of this sort of private consumption, which is also private production, it is very unlikely that it will run continually into overproduction. There is a limit to the number of apples a man can eat, and there will probably be a limit drawn by his rich and healthy hatred of work to the number of apples which he will produce but cannot eat. But there is no limit to the number of apples he may possess. But there is no limit of the number of apples he may possibly sell, and he soon becomes a pushing, dexterous, and successful salesman, and turns the whole world upside down. For it is he who produces this huge pantomimic paradox with which this rambling reflection began. It is he who makes a wilder revolution than this apple of Adam, which was the loosening of death, or the apple of Newton, which was the apocalypse of gravitation, by proclaiming the supreme blasphemy and heresy that the apple was made for the market and not for the mouth. It was he, by starting the wild race of pouring endless apples into a bottomless market, who opened the abyss of irony and contradiction into which we are staring today. That trick of treating the trade as the test, and the only test, has left us face to face with a piece of stark, staring nonsense written in gigantic letters across the world, more gigantic than all its own absurd advertisements and announcements, the statement that the more we produce, the less we possess. Oscar Wilde would probably have fainted with equal promptitude if told he was being used as an argument about American salesmanship, or in defense of a thrifty and respectable family life on the farm. But it does so happen that one true epigram among many of his false epigrams sums up correctly and compactly a certain truth, not, I am happy to say, about art, but about all that he desired to separate from art, ethics, and even economics. He said in one of his plays, A cynic is the man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." It is extraordinarily true, and the answer to most other things that he said. But it is yet more extraordinary that the modern men who make that mistake most obviously are not the cynics. On the contrary, They are those who call themselves the optimists, perhaps even those who would call themselves the idealists, certainly those who regard themselves as the regular guys and the sons of service and uplift. It is too often those very people who have spoilt all their good effect and weakened their considerable good example in work and social contact by that very error that things are to be judged by the price and not by the value. And since price is a crazy and incalculable thing, while value is an intrinsic and indestructible thing, they have swept us into a society which is no longer solid but fluid, as unfathomable as the sea and as treacherous as quicksand. Whether anything more solid can be built again upon social philosophy of values, there is now no space to discuss at length here, but I am certain that nothing solid can be built on any other philosophy, certainly not upon the utterly unphilosophical philosophy of blind buying and selling, of bullying people into purchasing what they do not want, of making it badly so that they may break it and imagine that they want it again, of keeping rubbish in rapid circulation like a dust storm in a desert, and pretending that you are teaching men to hope because you do not leave them one intelligent instant in which to despair.